Happy Earth Day, guys. I wrote a paper for a business class that I believe to be very good. And the professor did not think so. He thought the papers that were written by AI were better. So I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to share this paper on Earth Day. Just to start off, I am not a professional on this topic. I am a business student. I will be going into journalism, but I am nowhere in STEM. I do not correlate myself with anything. This is simply a research paper that I have done that I will be reading off. I don't want any legal battles, etc., etc. And I will include the full cited list linked somewhere in this video. It'll probably be in the description. But, all right, let's get into it. Okay. The corporate entrepreneurship behind the United States agricultural industry, the buzz behind cash crops. The United States has prided itself on mass production capacities for decades, spanning from hamburgers to oranges. Mass production of produce, especially, is a foolproof way to live and to feed a constantly growing population, with seemingly few side effects and massive profits for the growers and reasonably priced produce for the consumer. In the average consumer's eyes, farming is farming. It doesn't matter how large the farm becomes, yet when the agriculture becomes industrialized, it exceeds the bounds of what nature can produce, and oftentimes outside aid is needed to fulfill the demand created. The United States agricultural industry is a large vicious cycle where the head feeds on the tail, especially in California. Almonds are one of California's most profitable crops, and almonds are not even native to California. They are native to Southwest Asia. California produces over 80% of the entire world's supply of almonds, and they rely entirely on honeybees to pollinate their crops. Now, California has found itself amidst a bee shortage because of these almond crops. Since almonds are not native to California, the native pollinators have no interest in the almond plants and do not want to pollinate them. So California must bring in yet another prized species, honeybees. Honeybees are not even native to the entirety of the United States. They're actually Italian. Italian honeybees are most used for pollination in the United States due to their gentle demeanor. The undying need for honeybees in the US has turned them into an entire industry, not just for honey, but for the bees themselves. There are now companies strictly dedicated to raising, transporting, and selling these prized pollinators for the sake of optimizing and innovating the agricultural industry. Due to the current demand and immense profits of mass-produced cultivation and the industrialization of the food industry, nature has been forced to adapt under these pressures, and no one except the big farmers can keep up. The monetary value of the honeybee industry has absolutely skyrocketed. The Florida honeybee industry is worth around $4 billion, and globally it has a value of $200 billion to $500 billion, accounting for food production value as well. Now, why are honeybees so valuable? Because California isn't the only state using international honeybees to maximize its crops. The honeybees go on a long, year-round life cycle, almost like a nomad, going from location to location during each crop's blooming season. Almonds in California, over to the apple groves, over to Florida for oranges and avocados, and so on. While the produce is location-based, the bees are not. So without these bees, they're transporters, we would almost have no food mass-produced in the United States. Sorry, my grandfather clock was going off and my cats were fighting, so I had to pause it for a second. But to continue, the larger issue with this is that producing so much of one crop on a large scale requires an immense number of resources, such as land and water. Let's go back to California almonds for a moment. For companies like Blue Diamond Almonds, which you're all familiar with, which are the largest almond grower in the world, more than half of all of the almond farms in California are owned by Blue Diamond, and profits are everything for them. One of their recent annual income reports came in at $1.6 billion US, and Blue Diamond's sustainability report is like really, really bad. This is public information that you can find, by the way. Despite their recent efforts to plant other native species along their groves to lower carbon emissions and attract other pollinators, Blue Diamond's ranking is still 5 out of 100. One of the main reasons for the rating is the infamous California water wars. The California water wars is exactly what it sounds like. No one has enough water. With agriculture dominating over 80% of usable water sources, citizens are running dry. Almond acreage went from almost, this is a quote by the way, almond acreage went from over 640,000 acres to over 1.5 million acres. It's 1,640,000 acres between 2004 and 2021. Most of this land came from cutting down other local growers and crops, such as grapes, to plant more nut trees. So the wineries in California, see where I'm going with this. Almond growers and California citizens are using the same amount of water annually. So one singular crop is using the same amount as the entire state of California's citizens. And they're each using about 16% of the total allotted water supply. Most of these almonds are using up these limited resources, are not even being sold to residents. They are being exported overseas. China is one of the largest buyers of the California almonds, by the way. Almost none actually go to the United States citizens. California has gotten increasingly drier since the almond residents started there in 1895. The worst drought years that are recorded are from 2012 to 2016. Even with tireless efforts, drought still persists in many of the areas, such as San Joaquin Valley, making much of the soil nutrient deficient and prone to sporadic wildfires. Almonds specifically contribute so much to this water problem because nut crops cannot withstand drought. They need constant irrigation, and when water is already at a low, drilling prices have come to an all-time high, and only large nut growers can afford these costs. So other local crops don't need to have constant water to not die. They're a little bit more drought resistant. This isn't in the essay. This is just like an adverb. But almond trees need to constantly have a water supply in order to survive. So that's why they're depleting so much water sources for just one singular crop. And that's why it's so detrimental that they're cutting down other crops, because then that means they need more constant irrigation, and a lot of the water that comes from California is all through wells. So they have to keep digging larger and larger wells. So this is another quote, by the way. "We could save for a well instead of saving for our daughter's college, but it would be a gamble. We could never afford a well as deep as those farmers," Lorena says from Mother Jones. Once again, I'll put all the sources and the actual article that I wrote itself at the bottom or in the description. I'm not really great at YouTube, sorry. But the agricultural industry didn't necessarily think through its monoculture growing methods thoroughly. When the native pollinators aren't interested in what you planted and the honeybees you rely on start to get sick, you have a major issue. The native pollinators move to a new location or die out, and your livestock pollinators don't have enough immunity to the worldwide diseases they are being introduced to. The tequila industry went through something similar. With crops lacking genetic diversity from cloning and a lack of natural bat pollination, their crops were becoming prone to disease. The colonies of the honeybees are also falling ill. Pesticides have heavily contributed to the collapse of species, such as Ortho and Bayer Advanced, which contain neonicotinoids. I'm so sorry, I can't pronounce that. You should be able to pronounce that. That should not exist. But thanks to neonicotinoids that can be extremely toxic to pollinators, and even at doses that are not directly fatal to bees. They can cause cognitive problems that impact bees' foraging abilities and productivity of hives. 85% of almond trees are also treated with Roundup, which is highly toxic to bees, and other pollinators have also been polluting the groundwater supply that is already limited. Pesticides would take over 7 years to fully leave the soil and to be declared organic again. So to fully eliminate pesticides would not be an overnight change. So ironically, we use pesticides on our plants to help them not be affected by bad bugs and disease, but the pesticides also harm the good bugs that we need for crops to keep our plants producing. But the honeybees weren't being killed off by pesticides. The enormous Asian varroa mite was infiltrating our bees and targeting their immune system, with the immense traveling for crops weakening their immune system as well. Traveling working bees also get fed a caloric but nutrition-lacking diet of corn syrup instead of nectar. The varroa illnesses that the bees would get were contagious and would infiltrate the entire colony once a honeybee gets sick. And once a honeybee gets sick, the honeybee flees the colony. So hundreds and thousands of honeybees were going missing, and 33% to 50% of them were just flat out dying. The only way to keep the bees from getting sick is to, spray them down with a different sort of pesticides called varroicides, specifically made for the mites. So not even the bees are organic now. The agriculture and the bee industry took a hit, so many growers are now switching to supporting the natural pollinators for those crops that are able to. However, even with this blight, the Save the Bees slogan is Save the Bees. Sure, you've heard that. The Save the Bees slogan is not targeted towards honeybees, as one might think. Honeybees are one of the most populous species and one of the worst for the environment as well. That doesn't mean go out and kill the bees, but the Save the Bees campaign is targeted towards native endangered species, such as the rusted patch bee, the native pollinator for apples and cranberries, which have seen a 90% population loss. There are over 2.8 million honeybee colonies in the United States alone, with over 30,000 bees per colony. And more and more people are picking up beekeeping with honeybees as a hobby, thinking it's aiding conservation. This leaves very few resources left for native pollinators, since honeybees are livestock, not native. Honeybees are extreme generalist foragers and monopolize floral resources, thus leading to exploitative competition. That is, where one species uses up a resource, not leaving enough to go around. Honeybees are not selective pollinators, so they have been pollinating weedy and invasive species as well, worsening the issue. That means all of the native plants are also suffering now too, because weeds will choke out other plants. Now, if using honeybees is so detrimental, why do we continue to use them? Well, that is where we finally get to the business and logistic aspects of all of this. The monetary value of mass-produced crops in the United States is worth $244.9 billion US dollars, while the monetary value of locally grown produce is estimated at only $6 billion comparatively. Now, the technical definition of locally grown produce is a food product that is raised, produced, aggregated, stored, processed, and distributed in the locality or region in which the final product is marketed. No official national destination, though some individual USDA programs use a broad maximum definition. Less than 400 miles from the origin of the product or within the state in which the product is produced. Includes both direct-to-consumer sales and intermediated sales by distributors/food hubs to restaurants, grocery stores, schools, universities, hospitals, etc. Now, while I'm sure everyone is eager now to go and support their local farmers, markets, and organic growers, how feasible is that? If you don't live in California or Florida and are okay with eating less meat and seasonal foods, you'll be perfect for local growers. People, at least in the United States, have become too reliant on industrialized food that they cannot fathom a world without it. Now, industrialized food is a recent concept from only this past century. Your grandmother even did likely not have the pleasure of eating Florida fresh oranges during a North Dakotan winter. In theory, there are enough local growers and markets to feed about 90% of all Americans on that diet alone, and it would likely be beneficial for our health as well. Shockingly, only 6% of all food grown in the United States actually stays in the United States. The rest is exported. The real reason the switch hasn't been made is convenience and cost. You can't Grubhub your local farmer's market, and you might as well have to drive an extra few miles to get there yourself. The cost of locally grown foods are higher as well. Farmers usually only keep around 17 cents for every dollar of produce that they sell, unless they have a direct on-farm market. With fresh produce, there is also a smaller viable sell time than massively produced GMO-filled products, since there are no pesticides to keep everything looking beautiful and ripe for days. Around 30% of mass-produced food is thrown away before it even hits the market shelves as well, strictly because of appearance, even if the food is still perfectly good. Farmers must sell to the farmer's market, and then the farmer's market sells even more at an inflated price to you, since you are willing to pay for the delicious, vine-ripened, sustainable products. While the price cap isn't much higher, at only 1.2% increase on average, many people will still nickel and dime every purchase they make. Remember when lower meat diet was mentioned as well? This is because livestock, other than local premium farmers, feed their livestock soy. And soy plants take up over 30% of all United States crops. So the fewer soy crops we use strictly to feed the animals that are being raised just to grind up and sell to McDonald's, the more room we have for other native crops to feed the people of America. Let's go back to the honeybees and their monetary value. Soybeans self-pollinate, but often cash crops are still purchased by soy growers to speed up the process. So even with this cash crop that is worth $60.7 billion, honeybees are still living gold. Companies like Bloom Rider, or Bee Hauling USA, rack in about $30 million per year and are one of the only multiple large bee transporters. And our almond growers are still purchasing 60 to 90% of all livestock honeybees in the country annually. And that number is still rising as crops continue expanding. So all of this ecological damage to our native pollinators, our local crops, and our water supply can almost entirely be pointed back to almond growers. As seen with the water wars and the fight for local farmers to survive, the mass production of food has dominated our soil, and our crops are no longer prioritizing the consumer, but the cash. Thank you for listening. I hope you learned something.